Good morning. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois, but today I'm in Chicago, Illinois at the Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law, sitting across from Mr. Newton Minow. Good morning, Mr. Minow.
Good morning, Mark. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to do this.
Well, I'm delighted to have the opportunity. When I heard about this, I said, boy, I'm going to sign up to do that one, no problem at all. This is kind of a rarity for my program as the oral history director. We're doing a collaboration with two other institutions, and one obviously is with Northwestern, and the other was with the Illinois Supreme Court Commission on Professionalism, which is quite a mouthful, but they have a lot to be proud of, and they all want to have an opportunity to talk to you. Now, the reason we're doing this, and the reason I'm sitting across from you, Mr. Minow, is that you've expressed that you've done lots of these interviews before, and I'm going to run through a few, and then you can tell me the ones that I've missed. Obviously the Kennedy Library, the LBJ Library, the American Jewish Commission, one on the history of cable TV, which is a natural given your background, the Chicago History Museum, University of Chicago, Illinois, University of Illinois at Chicago on Mayor Daley. What else have I missed?
I think Columbia University for the Carnegie Foundation, and I think there have been a couple more, but at my age, you can't remember everything.
Well, I think it was a great idea when you said, hey, all these people want to do an interview with me. Why don't you all get together and sit down and do one interview? So, again, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity. And I always like to start off with the basics and just tell us briefly where and when you were born.
January 17th, 1926, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And by coincidence, one of your other interviewees, Judge Abner Mikva, and I were born 4 days apart in the same hospital.
Did you know each other growing up?
Very much so. We went to high school together. We were lifetime friends.
That's amazing. You know, most of us don't have that kind of connection. What an amazing person he was to interview as well.
He was remarkable, and he died in July 4th of last year, 2016, and I spoke at his memorial, and I told there was a well-known story. When he first went into politics, he volunteered at the Democratic headquarters in his neighborhood in Hyde Park, and the Democratic regular politician had a cigar in his mouth, and he said, "Who sent you?" And Abner said, "Nobody." And without taking the cigar out of his mouth, the politician said, "We don't want nobody sent."
That's a classic story of Chicago politics.
Well, I said, when he died on July 4th, and he arrived at the pearly gates, and the committeeman up there said, "Who sent you?" And Abner said, "Nobody." And the committee said, "Well, up here we don't care if nobody sent you. What's your name?" And he said, "Mikva." And he said, "Would you spell that? M-I-K-V-A." He said, "I'm going to Google you." And he Googled him, and he said, "I see you were a congressman, and you were a judge, and you were in the White House. There are two other guys who died on the 4th of July, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and they've invited you to dinner, so come on in."
What a great way to finish that story there. Thank you very much. Tell me just a little bit briefly about growing up in Milwaukee then.
It was during the Depression. My parents both were brought to the United States as small children by their parents, who were immigrants. And war was looming. One thing was that they had a great public school system, and got an excellent education at Washington High School on the west side of Milwaukee. And my father was in business. My mother was a volunteer and a homemaker. I had an older brother, Burton, who was physically handicapped from birth, and a younger sister. And we had, looking back, a very ideal childhood and a happy life. While I was in high school, Hitler invaded Poland, the war started. And as a senior, I enlisted in the Army and ended up as a sergeant in an engineering unit in the China-Burma India Theater.
You enlisted as a senior. Does that mean you didn't finish high school?
I missed the graduation, but I was there until a couple of weeks before graduation.
Tell me a little bit more about what you did. You just said in India, right? As an engineer, what were you working on there?
Our unit mission was to build the first telephone line connecting India and China. Ended in Kunming, China, and it was through Burma, through what was then called now Myanmar, the Burma Road. We finished that job in the spring of '45. And my assignment was very lucky. I was at the theater headquarters in New Delhi, India, running the switchboard. And we were told we were going to be going to Japan for the invasion, but then the atomic bomb was dropped and the war ended, fortunately.
What did you think about Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb?
Well, thinking back about it, it was a horrible thing, but I think it quickened the end of the war, and that was the most important thing. Morally, I never understood the difference between dropping an atomic bomb and dropping 500 other big bombs. Morally, it was the same.
Yeah, it's oftentimes overlooked that the firebombing of Tokyo probably took more lives than the other two.
Absolutely. But then I came home. I had been, before I went in the Army, I had applied for admission at Harvard. I didn't know anybody who had gone to Harvard or anything about it, but I had applied. And when I came home, I called Harvard and said, I'm back, and is my admission still good? They said, yes, but we want to warn you, we can't provide any housing for students. So we're putting up some tents in the Quonset huts. And I said, I'm sorry, I've been there and done that the last few years. And my dad suggested I apply to Northwestern. And I did and came here and loved it.
Did you know by the time you were finished up your time with the Army what you wanted to do with your life?
No, but I knew I was very interested, and I think it was probably because of the war. I was very interested in politics and government and doing everything possible to avoid another war.
When did you arrive at Northwestern? When did you start school?
It was the summer of '46.
So you didn't waste too much time.
No, then I did a very foolish thing. I was trying to make up for, quote, which I regard as lost time. And I raced through summers, went to Northwestern Law School on an accelerated program where you could get through in 29 months. Trying to, which was looking back, was really idiocy. I've shortchanged my education. But I got out of law school in the spring of 1950, which is the same time I would have gotten out of law school had I never been in the Army.
But you went through both undergraduate and law school in 29 months?
No, the law school was 29 months, but your first year of law school counted as your last year of college. So between starting in the summer of '46, in 1946, and then ending up in 1950, it was 4 years for both college and law school.
And then you go, whew. And then you got to take the law exams.
Well, then took the law exams, and then I got a very lucky break.
Well, before we get there, Mr. Minow, one other question, because apparently you were not spending all your time in the books while you're in college.
No.
That you had a chance to meet a young lady by the name of Josephine Baskin, is that right?
Yes, I met her actually in Evanston as an undergraduate, And we fell in love, got married while I was still in law school, got married in 1949. In fact, 2 days ago, we celebrated our 68th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's amazing.
Well, we've been very blessed.
One other quick question. Did you go to school on the GI Bill?
Yes, I did.
What's your opinion about that GI Bill, how important that was in American history?
I think there were 3 laws that changed America for the better. One was in the very beginning of our country, where we created, through the Northwest Ordinance, and created public schools. One was the act which created the land-grant colleges, and the third was the GI Bill. They all educated the nation and gave us a chance for a free, prosperous, wonderful country.
What was it about the law that appealed to you? Why that profession?
I didn't know very much about it. 2 of my father's brothers, 2 of my uncles were lawyers, but I don't know that that had a big impact on me. I think it was because the law and government were essential to each other, and I was fascinated by that.
I would imagine that, like most graduates, maybe all graduates, that you were somewhat idealistic about the future. What did you hope to accomplish as a lawyer then?
In the Bible, in Deuteronomy, in the Jewish Torah, it says, "Justice, justice shalt thou pursue." Justice, justice. And I think that was a very major part of it. And I wanted to be a lawyer, and I wanted to also participate in the political and governmental functions of society.
Mr. Minow, I cut you off before. What happens then after you to take the bar? Where do you go next?
I got a great job with a fine law firm in Chicago. I started there, and a few months into that, the law school called me and said that a law clerk for Chief Justice Vinson at the Supreme Court of the United States, Dan Walker, who had been roughly in my a semester ahead of me at law school, he'd been called back to the Navy in the Korean War, and there was a vacancy at the Supreme Court. Prior to that, the law school had recommended me to Justice Minton, and I went for an interview with Justice Minton, and he told me that he'd like to hire young people from the Midwest. He himself was a U.S. Senator from Indiana when he went on the Supreme Court. But he said he had just hired a guy named, he couldn't remember if it was Mifka or Miska. I said that was Abner Mikva, my childhood friend. So Abner got that job, but then a few months later I got this call about Chief Justice Vinson, and I got that job, and Joe and I moved to Washington, and I became a law clerk. One of my fellow law clerks is my law partner today. We've been together for 60 plus years, Howard Trenans. But I became the 3rd law clerk for Chief Justice Vinson at the Supreme Court.
This is quite a list of some of the prominent people in Illinois politics that you've already mentioned here. Dan Walker, Abner Mikva, yourself. Who else in those early years did you encounter?
Well, then another lucky thing happened. One of our law professors, actually my favorite, Carl McGowan, was then the counsel to the then governor of Illinois, Anthony Stevenson, number 2. And he came and he had a talk with Howard, unbeknownst to me, and offered Howard the job of becoming his assistant counsel to Governor Stevenson. Howard and I carpooled it back and forth to the Supreme Court every day. And Howard told me about it on the way home. I said, "Are you interested?" And he said, "No." He said, "I want to go back to my firm, Sidley Austin. And I told my wife about it. And Joe said, you know, are looking for something to do after you finish at the court, and you admire Governor Stevenson. Why don't you see if you could be it? So Howard called Carl, arranged for me to be interviewed by Governor Stevenson. And I was interviewed, and then a wild coincidence happened. Governor Stevenson arranged for me to meet him for breakfast at 7 in the morning. And I did, and I didn't read the paper or get any news of that day. He interviewed me. Then I took him to his next appointment. And he said to me at breakfast, he said, now, if I offer you this job, is there any reason why you wouldn't take it? And I said, well, my current boss, Chief Justice Vinson, is rumored to be President Truman's choice to be his successor and the Democratic candidate for president. And I said, if the Chief Justice decides to do that, and he asked me to stay, I would want to stay with him. And Adley looked at me and he said, I don't think that's very likely. I dropped him off. I went to work and picked up the New York Times. I still have it at home in the scrapbook. And the headline on the front page was, Truman asks Stevenson to run, semicolon, Vinson out. Our breakfast was the day after President Truman had called Stevenson to the White House, told him he wanted to back him for president.
Was that summer of 51?
52. It was the spring. It was around February or March of 52.
So before the primary season.
There weren't, no, I think Truman, I'm trying to remember, I think Truman did badly in one primary at that point. But Truman had announced he wasn't going to run. Turned out that Vinson said no. And I stayed till the end of the term. And then I was supposed to leave on a certain date, and I went in to see the chief. And I said, I'd like to go to the Democratic Convention. It's in Chicago. There's nothing going on here. Would you mind if I left 1 week early? And he said, that's okay with me. He said, but your guy's not going to get it. I said, what? He said, I was with President Truman last night. He told me he's disgusted with Adley. He says he can't make up his mind. He's indecisive. It's going to be Alvin Barkley. Barkley was the vice president at that time. Well, but he said, you can go. So I went to the convention, and I met with Carl and Bill Blair, Adley's other assistants. I told them what Chief Justice Vinson had told me. And they were shocked. It turned out it was true. And Truman tried to get it for Barkley, but the delegates said, no, he's too old. And that opened it up to a draft, and Stevenson was drafted. And then Adley called me in to see him. He said, I hired you to be my assistant in Springfield working as governor. That isn't going to happen. If you don't want to stay, you don't have to. And I said, of course I want to stay. So I stayed and was involved both in Springfield and in the campaign.
Well, that is an amazing story. And the coincidences of this all the way through here.
Well, then on top of that, that's when I started meeting people. I became friendly at that point with Sergeant Shriver, who was Jack Kennedy's brother-in-law, and that led eventually to other things.
The clerkship in the Supreme Court, is that typically a one-year tour?
It's usually, with the chief it was 2 years, and I was there for a year and a half. The chief asked me to stay on, which would have been 2.5, but I, again, was anxious to get on with my life.
Sure. Give me your impressions of Adlai Stevenson.
Adlai was, in my opinion, a superb governor. He would have been a superb president. Everybody said he's indecisive. He was completely decisive on issues and had a strong moral force on issues. He was indecisive sometimes about his own career and what he should be doing for himself. That part of it was true. He ran a magnificent campaign against hopeless odds. There was no way he could conceivably beat Eisenhower. After he lost, I went back to my old law firm. And a year or two into that, he called me and said, I'd like you to come out to see me and spend a day with me at my farm in Libertyville. I went out there. He said, I'm going to ask you to do something. And if I were your father, I would tell you not to do it. But I'm not your father. He said, I'm starting a new law firm with somebody, two people you know, Willard Wirtz, who was a professor at Northwestern Law School, my professor, and William McCormick Blair, Jr., whom I knew from the 52 years in Springfield. And we'd like you to join us. And I thought it over, talked to my wife. I knew it was a risky thing. But Adley had said to me, if you want some adventure, come with us. So I joined him. Then in 56 came, I strongly urged him not to run for president again. I knew it was hopeless. He was invited to, and again, this is, I think, a very important story. Lyndon Johnson had a heart attack and was recovering in Texas. He was majority leader of the Senate. President Eisenhower had a heart attack. He was suffering. I think he had it out of town somewhere. Adley was scheduled to go to the University of Texas to give a speech and was to spend the night at LBJ's ranch. Bill Blair, who usually traveled with Adley, was sick, so Adley asked me to go with him. Because of all the things going on with Eisenhower and Johnson, the press was all over us. Adley gave his speech, and we rode to LBJ's ranch with Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, and got there, and LBJ said, we're not going to stay in the House tomorrow because all the press is, national press is here. They think we're plotting how to take over the country with President Eisenhower sick. We'll be out in the morning, 6 o'clock, where everybody can see us. So we spent the day there, and of course, on the way home, Adley and I were flying back, and Adley said, Lyndon and Sam told me that if I want the nomination next time, this was in the fall of 55, if I want the nomination next year, I'll have to run in the primaries. I said, well, they're right. I said, if Eisenhower doesn't run, you'll have every Democrat in the country wanting to become president. And at that time, it didn't look like Eisenhower was going to run. He said, well, I'm not going to do that. He said, I'm not going to run around like campaigning for sheriff at the shopping centers. And I said, well, if Eisenhower runs, you should forget about it. There's no way you could win. Well, Eisenhower recovered, ran, and he ran in the primaries, going to the shopping center, and he lost again, but this time by a much bigger margin than the first time. But that's what happened, and then went back to the law firm. Bill Blair and I tried to get Adley to endorse Kennedy. It failed. There's one other interesting thing that happened in 50. After he lost in 56, he was invited to give the Gridiron speech in Washington. He took me, there was a small dinner party the night before, It's the first time I ever met Jackie. I had met Jackie, but Jack and Jackie were there. And Jack, we called him Jack at that time. He was not that different in age than I was.
Same generation.
Same generation. So he came over to me and he said, Newt, I want to thank you for helping me get the vice presidential nomination at the convention. And I said, well, it's a good thing you didn't get it. And he said, you're right. I said, if you're still interested, I think you could get the vice presidential nomination next time. And he looked at me and he said, vice president? Vice president? He said, are you nuts? He said, I'm going to run for president. I said, you're the one that's nuts. I said, you're 39 years old. He said, am I ever going to be president? It'll be next time.
Going a little bit more, a couple more questions on your association with Stevenson. What exactly were you doing in these two campaigns, 52 and 56?
Well, in 52, they called me the governor because everybody else was gone. They were traveling all the time. I had a prison riot I had to deal with. I was 26 years old. The fact of the matter, the legislature was not in session. But I had to deal with all kinds of things. And then I particularly worked with the speechwriters. My job was to get them housing, get them secretarial help, and so on. And that's when I got to know Arthur Schlesinger Jr., because Arthur and I lived together at Carl McGowan's house, and got to know John Bartlow Martin and a bunch of the other, Kenneth Galbraith, a bunch of the other people. I was working with the speech people.
But you started by saying that you were essentially the governor while the governor was out on the camp.
In the speech, in the case of the prison riot, I called that. I said, I think you better come back. And he did. And he went to the prison and it ended. But other than that, whenever there was something important, I'd call. But basically, government slowed down for those couple of months.
But you mentioned you were working with the speechwriters. I would have thought the speechwriters were on the campaign trail with him.
Some were and some weren't. Some were back. They alternated.
Okay. I know he inspired that generation. Obviously, he lost in a fairly significant way, but he also inspired a generation of other young politicians, didn't he?
There's no question. And his idealism and his leadership became, I think, the essence at that time of the idealism of the Democratic Party.
What were your own personal political views at that time?
I was not a Democrat. I was an independent. Adley made me a Democrat. But I was basically not partisan. I'm still, today, although I'm a Democrat, I hate partisanship.
And you spent your life working in an increasingly partisan world.
Yes, and I'm very disappointed with it. I think that our current 2017 situation is despicable.
Maybe you just answered my next question, but I'll ask it anyway. At that time, or is there any time that you seriously considered throwing your own hat in the ring and running for office?
When I came home from being the chairman of the FCC, Mayor Richard J. Daley was the mayor. And he called me and invited me to lunch. He took me to the Empire Room of the Palmer House, just the two of us. He had a lot of questions about what was going on in Washington, the Kennedys, and we had a good talk. And then he said, are you interested in running for office? And I said, no, Mayor, I have no interest in that. He said, isn't there any public office that you'd like to have? And I said, well, as long as you're asking, I would love to be a delegate to the Democratic Convention. At that time, they were picked in the back room by the mayor. And he groaned. He said, He said, everybody wants to be a delegate. He said, are you sure? How about governor, senator? And I said, no, Mayor, I have no interest. Well, he didn't quite trust me. He made me an alternate delegate, which I read about in the newspaper. Later, I did run, and I was an elected delegate, a number of conventions. But I had absolutely no interest in running myself.
Well, those were the days of Mayor Richard J. Daley, the slate makers, basically
Yes.
going down the ballot and picking everybody and then getting the machine to run behind you. What was your impression of Mayor Daley?
Well, I met Richard J. in Springfield because he was in Adley's cabinet. He was in charge of revenue for the state of Illinois. So I knew him from the Springfield days. And he asked Adley to help him when he first ran for mayor in '55. And I helped then, and I got to know the Daley family, and I liked and respected Mayor Daley.
Well, I'm a representative from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum, so I got to ask you this question that I ran across. I don't know which campaign it was, but apparently there was a time that you and Robert Kennedy were in Springfield and visited the Abraham Lincoln home.
In '56, after Jack Kennedy didn't get the vice presidential nomination, but certainly had in mind a national future, the family assigned Robert to become part of the Stevenson campaign staff in '56 because they wanted him to learn about national campaign. Because Robert and I were the same age, we frequently ended up together as roommates. And we got to Springfield, got off the plane. Adley was giving a speech. And Bob said to me, you and I have heard that speech 5,000 times. He said, how far is Abraham Lincoln's house from here? I said, it's a walk. We can get back and forth within 10 minutes. And he said, let's play hooky and take me over to show me where Lincoln's house. So the two of us went over to Lincoln's house. At that time, it was not as it is today when it was fixed up and with a fence around it and everything. I showed him Lincoln's house. And we're walking back, and Bob said to me, you know, when I was a child, he said, I thought there were three great influences on a child: home, school, church. Now, he said, in my home, with my kids, I see there's a fourth. It's the television set. He said, my kids are fascinated. They're watching television too much. They're not So I told him that I was the lawyer for the Encyclopedia Britannica Film Company, which made educational films. So from time to time, I'd send him or loan him one, send it in the mail, and he showed it to his kids on Saturday morning and sent it back. These were the films shown in school. And Bob remembered that. And then when Jack was elected in '60, Sarge Shriver called me the next day, wanted me to he said, the president-elect wants you to come into the government. And I said, I can't do it. I can't afford it, can't do it. And he asked me to help him with the recruiting process, which I did. Somehow Sarge learned that I was so interested in television. And Bob knew I was very interested in television. So they asked me to become chairman of the FCC. I was 34 years old. I told this to Adley, and he said, no. He said, you must have misunderstood it. 34 years old, they're not going to ask you to be chairman of the FCC. And besides, he said, I want you to stay here and keep the law firm going, because when I'm through at the UN, I want to come back, and I want to be life as it was before.
And the law firm again that you were at was?
Yeah, we were then the Chicago office of the Paul Weiss firm in New York, which was still today a great firm. And I was doing very well in the firm. And I said, well, yeah, but the chairman of the FCC, this is something that I'm very interested in. And they said, well, you have to make up your own mind, but I hope you don't do it. And I accepted. Then Adley gave a talk, and he said, I'm so sorry I have only one law firm to give to the country because all four of us went in the government.
Why didn't he want you to be the chairman of the FCC?
Adley?
Yeah.
Well, he wanted me to stay in Chicago with the law firm.
So
As
he
simple
had
as that.
selfish reasons.
Well, I understood. But it all started, I think, in that walk from Lincoln's house. And I told the Kennedys when they asked me to do this, I had no money. And the job paid $20,500 a year. I said, I can stay for 2 years. 2 years to the day, I called the president, said, I'd like to see you. And I walked in the president, he saw me within a day or two. And I walked in the president's office, and the president said, I know what you want. You want to go home. He said, you're the one guy I brought here who never has asked to see me. I would see him periodically at events, but I never once asked to see him. He said, you want to go home? I said, that's right. He said, you don't want another job here? And I said, no. I said, I can't afford it. And I said, I've got a job which had nothing to do with the FCC. That's the only kind of job I will take. And it's back home. So he said, well, will you stay till I get a replacement for you? I said, of course. Well, that took 6 months. I'm sorry I did that.
You're sorry that you...
Well, he got killed within, and I'm sorry I left.
Tell me about that day, 1963, November 63.
I never got over it, but still not over it. When the White House called me to tell me that President Obama was going to give me the Presidential Medal of Freedom, I said, what's the date? They said, November 22nd. I said, that's the date JFK was killed. And whoever called me didn't know that. But it seared in me. It was one of the great tragedies of our time.
I want to spend a few more minutes talking about that experience, and let's start with this question. Did you have to go to congressional hearings to get approved as the...
Yes, and I had the benefit of having two esteemed senators from Illinois at my side, Senator Paul Douglas and Senator Everett Dirksen. It was a Democrat and a Republican.
And they're both heavy hitters at that time.
They were, both of them, and both of them supported me, and was, in fact, Senator Dirksen was, whom I had hardly known, was extravagant in his praise for me.
You remember any of his comments about you?
Not specifically, but I had a lot of experience with him later when I was in the government.
Any stories there, Mr. Minow?
Well, one day I was at the office and Senator Dirksen called me and he said, my friend Newt, he said, I would like to come to see you today, but I'm chained to my office because there are a lot of things on the floor and I can't leave. Would you mind at the end of the day coming over to my little hideaway office just off the Senate floor? I said, I'll be glad to, Senator. So I called the staff in. I said, what does Senator Dirksen want to see me about? Must be something going on in Illinois he's interested in. And they said, well, there's a problem with the television station in Springfield. The guy that owns it is a friend of Senator Dirksen. Augie Meyer is his name. I said, what's the problem? They said, well, they violated some rules or something. It's in a hearing. You can't talk about it with the senator. I said, why is that? They said, well, the process, it's in an adjudicatory hearing. It's like a judge. So verboten for you to discuss it with anybody. I said, fine. So I go to Dirkson's office. He's got this little hideaway office. He said, how about a drink? He pours me a bourbon, and we sit down. And we talk a while, and I can see this isn't just a social visit. And then he says to me, no, I want to talk to you about a little problem in Springfield. And he starts to tell me about it. And I said, Senator Dirksen, I'm not allowed to discuss that with you. He said, oh, come on, you're from Illinois, I'm from Illinois. Let's talk about this. I said, I'm sorry. I said, I don't want to get you in trouble. I don't want to get myself in trouble. Cannot discuss it. It's in a stage of an adjudicatory hearing, and we're not allowed to. We're like a judge. We can't do that. He said, oh, come on. And he said, all right. He said, if you want to be that way. He said, let me give you a hypothetical case. It gives me, so I still wouldn't talk about it. We remained friends, but I wouldn't talk about it. Then I went to one event I never forgot where he was giving a speech. And he was giving advice to people about how to get along in Washington. And he said, always stand on principle. Always stand on principle. And your first principle is be flexible. But I loved him.
Well, he's one of a long, colorful cast of characters from Illinois politics, isn't he?
He was, and he was a good friend to me.
A little bit more, this happened during that 1960 campaign, which is a very memorable campaign. You've got Nixon versus Kennedy, and you know where this is going. I don't know that, were you involved at all with that first presidential debate in 1960?
I was involved in this way. Broadcasters were seeking to change the equal time law. They were trying very hard. And Adley wrote an article for a magazine called This Week. It's no longer in existence. It was distributed with newspapers all over the country. And the essence of the article was, we can have better campaigns for president. He described all the running around in 52 and 56. He said, why don't we use television and have, the headline they put on it for great debates. And I helped him with the article. The Senate was considering having hearings on what to do about the equal time law. They called Adley to testify. This was in the spring of 1960. Again, I'm the junior lawyer. I drafted the first draft of Adley's testimony, in which he advocated that a certain amount of time without charge be provided by the networks to the candidates for television, and never calling for debates, but time where they gave their opposing views. He went to testify, and in the course of that testimony, the subject of debates came up. And they asked Adley what he thought about debates. He said that would be a very good thing. That led to a law that was passed weeks before the first debate. Imagine that, weeks before the first debate, which exempted debates from the equal time law for the presidential election of 1960 only. For that, it was an experiment. That led, so because of that law, we had the 4 Kennedy-Nixon debates. At the end of that election, the law did not change. So there were no debates, 64, 68, 72. 76, the FCC, without Congress, reinterpreted the equal time law to permit debates, provided they were run by a non-broadcaster. The League of Women Voters then organized the 76 debates, asked me to organize them, become the co-chairman. So that was our involvement with the debates.
For the 1960 debates, did you watch them on TV, listen to the radio?
In fact, I was with a client in California on a very important negotiation, and I said to our client, I said, between the hours of whatever it was in California, I said, I'm not going to be available because I'm going to watch the debate. My college roommate at Northwestern, Sandy Van Oker, was one of the questioners.
Your whole life is just
Series
woven
of
in with all these
coincidences,
people.
yeah.
Amazing.
People call me Zelig.
Yeah. Now, the line on that particular series of debates is that for people who listened to the debates on the radio, they thought Nixon won. For those who watched the debate on TV, they thought that Kennedy won. What's your view on that particular subject?
I think that's true. Nixon looked nervous, didn't look well. Kennedy had a dark suit. Nixon wore a light suit. Nixon was sallow. Kennedy looked like he was tanned. Kennedy was very confident. Nixon was not. So it showed you that seeing a person was as important as what they said. At that point, it looked like Nixon was experienced. He'd been vice president for 8 years. Who knew? People didn't know Kennedy. Kennedy equalized it in that debate as being knowledgeable and prepared to be president.
And you have now written a book on the subject of presidential debates.
Yes, I thought it was important for the background to have all that. So I have, with my colleague, Professor Craig LeMay at Northwestern at Medill. I still serve today, after all these years, on the Presidential Debate Commission, and I've been involved with every single debate.
How important do you think debates are as part of America's political psyche, if you will?
I think they're extremely important not only for America, but for democracy. We have helped other countries. I think we've helped 21 countries, believe it or not, including Iran. Iran, if you can believe that, has presidential televised debates. And we've helped the spread of democracy through debates in 21 countries so far.
And how many of those have you personally been involved with?
I haven't, but our commission has.
Well, that's amazing. Any other countries that come to mind when you're thinking about being surprised that even that country is taking
Iran is, a lot of the new countries in Africa, which have not had democracy before, and they all do it differently. Sometimes you get 21 candidates for trying to participate. It's fascinating to see how that technology is growing.
Well, since we're here, Mr. Minow, your impression of this last cycle, both the Republican primary debates and then the presidential debates.
Before I answer that, I have to say that Northwestern Law School was responsible in 1976 for the FCC's change. The chairman of the FCC at that time was a Northwestern law graduate, a Republican named Dick Wiley. The lawyer who wrote the petition, Henry Geller, is a Northwestern graduate in 1949, and I. So Northwestern Law School graduates, three of us, were responsible for the changing the law on the debates. The primary debates I thought were disgraceful. The broadcasters ran them, not the commission. And they were trying to promote their own stars. Some of them had crowds that were interrupting. They were not educational, they were nasty. And I did not think they contributed to an informed electorate.
Okay. Let's go back to your period as the chair of the FCC. And, today that's an important position, but there's lots of other positions. But I've gotten the impression that you, as the chair of the FCC, got an awful lot of attention and an awful lot of press. And oftentimes people are referring to that speech that you gave. And I guess I'll turn it over to you and let you talk about that speech and what happened in the aftermath of that.
It's traditional for a new FCC chairman to speak annually at the National Convention of the Broadcasters. And I knew the speech was in May of '61. I knew that there would be a lot of attention paid to that speech. There had been scandals in the industry involving payola, involving the quiz shows. There had been scandals at the FCC. President Eisenhower was forced to fire the chairman of the FCC. There had been improper conduct. The place was a mess. The industry was a mess. The FCC was a mess. So,
primarily at the TV or also in radio and
radio and TV. In radio, there was payola, where money was being paid by record companies to DJs to promote. The morality had sunk in both places. And I knew we had to straighten it out. And I also knew that television was changing the lives, particularly of children, without much attention being paid to what it was doing. So I used that occasion, and I had the help. When I was first appointed, my friend Howard Trenans said to me, Henry Geller, who went to law school with us, used to work at the FCC. He got disgusted and left, went to the department. You ought to call Henry, see if you can get him to come back with you, because then you'll have somebody who knows the territory. So I called Henry, and Henry did come back. He was a huge help to me. I had John Bartlow Martin, one of the best speechwriters in the world, who offered as a friend to do a draft of a speech for me. He didn't know what had happened. He watched television for 24 hours, and he said it was a vast wasteland of junk. I crossed off the of junk, and that I paid no attention. But the two words, vast wasteland, registered with the country. It got an enormous amount of attention. The other thing I wanted to do was promote public television. I had gone to Washington from Chicago, where we had a public television station. JFK had gone to the White House from Boston. There was a public television. To our amazement, there was no public television station in Washington, none in New York, none in Los Angeles, none in Philadelphia, went around the country. I was determined to get that going.
What did you think the public television was going to be able to do differently or better than what commercial TV was doing?
I thought that there had to be a service, as in other countries, that was not commercial, that was not driven by advertising, that was educational and informative, and particularly I wanted something for children. And we succeeded. I had 3 pieces of legislation. All 3 passed. In fact, one night at home, President Kennedy called me, and he said, "How the hell did you do that?" And I said, "My bills are not partisan. I run a bipartisan agency. I totally stay out of any partisanship. And I get as much support from the Republicans as I get from the Democrats. That's just the way we do it." He said, "I wish I could do that." I said, "Well, you got a different set of issues." I said, our success has been staying out of any partisan fights. We have the communication satellite legislation, the all-channel bill, which led to UHF. That really created the public broadcasting system. And we had, in addition to that, we passed a bill for the first federal funds to help communities build a public television station. That all began.
The first two, I wonder if you could explain a little bit more the impact of those pieces of legislation.
The all-channel bill meant that at that time there were called VHF channels from 1 to 13. That was dominant. Most television sets didn't have a tuner for the channels that were available from 14 to 83. We passed a law, which is a very unusual law, that said if you're going to manufacture a television set, it must have a UHF tuner. Must. No ifs, ands, and buts. And I got the industry to go with us. That was if I'd been fighting, I got the industry was divided, but there were at least, like Zenith was with us. RCA was with us. Some of them were not. That led to multiplying the number of choices, television stations, by the hundreds. Second, the communication satellite thing. That was we were in a mad race with the Russians. And there was an old-time commissioner on the FCC who came to see me the first day I was on the job. He said, "You know what a communication satellite is?" I said, "No." He said, he groaned. He said, "I was afraid of that." He said, "This is so important. It's the one place we're ahead of the Russians. Nobody pays any attention to this." I said, "If you will teach me, and if you're right, believe me, we'll pay attention to it." And he taught me. He was right. We were ahead of the Russians. I testified 13 times in Congress for the law, and we sent up Telstar, which was ahead of the Russians, and that changed everything. Third, there had never been any funding to help educational television. So we got a small amount to help them buy equipment, not for programming. That led to many, many smaller communities around the country building stations where there were none. And so those three things, those were the three things I wanted, and I got them done in 2 years, and I was very proud of that.
At the time, obviously you thought these pieces of legislation were important, but did you have an understanding at that time the impact that they were going to have on American society?
I did not. I knew it would change, but I had no idea how it would totally change things.
I mean, you were talking about an age when you got into office, how many networks essentially?
2.5.
2.5.
No public television. No, cable also we encouraged, and cable was just in its infancy. At that time, the broadcasters loved cable because it was taking their signal into places that couldn't be seen over the air. So the broadcasters encouraged it. And then cable grew up and started programming and started doing things on its own. And I still believe, that the most important role of government in this area was to expand choice. So the viewer had more choice. And that was what we decided to do.
That choice part of the equation, though, has really been something only in the last 3 decades, perhaps? What added choice was cable, was UHF, was satellites, and pay television. Things like HBO, Showtime, they're financed by the viewer rather than the advertiser. Yeah, and sometimes I think Americans don't understand the significance of what sometimes might be lost in the history pages of important pieces of legislation like that.
Well, I think that's true, and as time goes on, I think more and more people, now you've got a whole different set of issues. Now you've got the internet, what's called network neutrality. Now it's a whole new ballgame for the current generation.
Let's go back to that speech, and I don't know if you would characterize it this way, but the throwaway phrase of vast wasteland, and then suddenly this is all coming back at you, and that old adage comes to mind that you don't want to take in the newspapers when they buy their ink by the barrel. And I wonder if you felt like that to a certain extent after you had that speech and got the reaction that you got.
Well, the newspapers at that time were much more successful, and they hated television because the print guys saw their advertising being taken away. So they loved what I was doing because they perceived me erroneously as being anti-television. I happen to be a television junkie. I just wanted more and better television, not...
But I would imagine the TV executives and the advertising executives weren't too pleased by it all.
At the time. Later, after I went back to private life and years later, in addition to being very deeply involved in public television here in Chicago and nationally, I served on the board of a big international advertising agency, on the board of CBS. So I have seen every side of this elephant from every perspective. And it's not a matter of people being wrong, it's people seeing things differently from different angles.
Are there any particular stories that come to mind about the reaction the speech got?
Well, my favorite was the chairman of the National Association of Broadcasters, who later became a good friend of mine, was the former governor of Florida, Leroy Collins. And he and I were standing on the platform after the speech. And a man came up to me and he said, Mr. Chairman, he said, I really didn't think your speech was very good. So I listened, and Roy put his arm around me and he said, don't pay any... He came back a few minutes later. He said, as I was thinking about it, Mr. Chairman, he said, that was the worst speech I ever heard in my life. And Roy said to me, don't pay any attention to him. He just repeats everything he hears.
Well, this might be a peculiar question, but I'm wondering if the wife and your daughters agreed with some people's assessment that you were just a snob when it came to television.
They didn't. They're very polite. But a lot of people, as I say, I think they thought I didn't like television. That was missing the whole point. I love television. Now, talking about the Kennedy years, I should tell you the most important thing that happened to me was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I knew something was going on. I didn't know what it was, but I got a call from the State Department, and they said, are you going to be in town in the next few days in a week? And I said, I have to go to New York on such and such a day. I'm meeting with the European broadcasters to plan the satellite program with us. And they said, well, will you leave us a number where you can be reached at every minute? It's the first time that ever happened. Well, at 7 in the morning, I was having breakfast with Frank Stanton, the president of CBS. He and I were to talk at 9 o'clock to the European broadcasters. And we were going through the program. And the waiter came up and said, there's an important phone call for you downstairs. I went down, it was the White House. It was the press secretary, Pierre Salinger. He said, there's a national emergency. We need you here immediately. Doesn't tell me what it is, but I knew something important was going on. So I went back, I said, Frank, I can't stay. He said, I have to go back to Washington. He said, well, I've got a car and driver downstairs. You take them, they'll take you to the airport. I got on the shuttle. I was in the White House within 2.5 hours and saw Pierre. And Pierre says, the Russians have missiles in Cuba. The president is going to speak to the nation tonight, but the Voice of America is being jammed by the Russians. and the president wants his speech heard in Cuba. And we're told by the engineers at the Voice of America that there are 6 American commercial radio stations whose signals reach Cuba. And we want you to carry the Voice of America, arrange that. And you cannot tell the stations anything. I said, yes, sir. And I went to the office, I called in our senior staff, and I told them, swore them to secrecy. I said, how do you do that? And they said, it's not complicated. We can do that. I said, how do you do that? I said, well, first, they said, we think it's 8 stations, not 6. And they're all around the country in different places. We can call AT&T and have them patch a line to each of their transmitters to the voice transmitter. And I said, will the stations know about it? They said, no. I said, well, let's do it. So they did that. And then I said to myself, how can we do this without telling the stations? This is not right. So I called Pierre. I said, you're going to have to let me do it my way. And I'm going to have to tell this. He said, if there's a leak, I'll kill you. And I said, there won't be a leak. So I called all 8 stations. And I said, I want the owner, there's a national emergency, and I do not want you saying anything about this to your news staff or anybody. I want you to be a patriot. This is not to be talked about. I want the owner of the station, and give me a number. I'm going to call you from the White House at 6 o'clock. If the owner's not available, I want the person in charge. He said, okay, and there was never a leak. I went back to the White House, and Pierre and I together called each of the stations, told them what had happened, and told them that at 8 o'clock, the Voice of America signal would be coming out of their transmitter, that they should simply announce, we have an important announcement from the White House. And that's it. Pierre said, we want you to come to the White House tomorrow morning at 7 to meet with, we call it the XCOM, whatever it was. So I went there, and the president looks at me and says, it worked. I said, good. How they knew that, they must have had CIA or somebody on the ground. So I left. I was starting to leave. And he said, let's do it again tonight. And let's do it till this crisis is over. Well, that took a week, 7 or 8 days. Stations all cooperated. And then when it was over, 7 of the 8 called me and said, where do we send the bill? And I said, what do you mean? What kind of bill? They said, well, we dropped all our revenue. We didn't take any advertising for the week. So I called, Edward R. Murrow was the head of the voice of the USIA. I said, you got any money for this? He said, no. I called Pierre. I said, you got any money for this? He said, no. I said, well, I certainly don't. And I said, I think they're entitled to something, but let's do this. If you let me invite them to the White House for lunch with the president, I think they'll drop it. So he did, and each of them had their picture taken, and it was a big deal. About 6 months later, the president of a Catholic college university in New Orleans called me. And they owned one of the stations that had helped us. And he said, I'm coming to Washington. Our television station, which we own, has got some problem with the FCC. Could I come in to see you, please? So I said, fine. So he's a Jesuit priest. He came into my office. He said, remember me? He said, remember we helped you with the Cuban Missile Crisis? I said, yes, Father. He said, well, in view of what we did for you, I wonder if you could do something for us. I said, I'd be glad to, Father. What is it? He said, well, we got a little problem with our television set. They violated some rule or something. So I called the staff. I said, I want to know what the problem is. Drop it. I'd probably go to jail if I did that today. But it took a Jesuit priest to have the guts to come to me, and we straightened that out. I always remember that.
You think today that all those stations, if you to do something like that today, that they would honor your request to keep it secret?
It's a good question. I never thought of it. I doubt it.
The other curiosity I have you heard any stories from Cuban emigres who heard that radio?
One. Actually, it was from an American soldier. There was a guy who was at Guantanamo who told me he heard it.
That had to feel great to hear that story, though, I would think.
Well, it was very rewarding to me. And I was very proud of the broadcasters for it was an important public service.
Tell me a little bit about the mood of the country. I mean, you're right in the middle of this with an important piece of the Cuban Missile Crisis. How would you describe the mood of the country during that week?
I think everybody was scared to death. Certainly I was. I thought this could be the end of the earth. At that time, I was on the list. A certain number of federal officials were on the list to travel with the president to some underground headquarters, and I said, I'm not going.
That request has got to get your attention, though.
Yeah, but I said, I'm going to be with my family. I'm not going.
This period of your life was so productive. Looking back, what would you think the thing that you are most proud of in terms of your period with the FCC?
Well, I think we restored the reputation of the FCC, which at that time, actually, a Northwestern law graduate, David Bazelon, was a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia. That's the court that most appeals from an FCC order went to. And he called me one day, and he said, would you come up here for lunch with the judges? And I said, yes. Chief Justice Berger was then on that court. And they said, we want you to know that we've tabulated the last 11 cases that the FCC was in our court. The last 11 cases. The FCC lost all 11. And we want you to know that our experience with your agency in the last few years has been terrible. We do not trust what the FCC is telling us. It was true. It was a dark period. And we want you to know that we think you should straighten the place out. This was the judges telling me this. And as a result, I got Henry Giller. We changed the lawyers, and what was also most important, we changed what we were doing with our policies were. And we restored the confidence of the rest of the government with us. It was terrible.
Looking back, what was it that you did to turn around the agency?
Number one, I think we started getting a lot tougher with the industry, with our policies. And I think the public, the Congress, the same thing was true with the Congress. It wasn't just the courts. We were regarded as being unreliable and not trustworthy. We changed our policies, and I think we were successful with that.
Where to after your period with the FCC, then?
Well, I had decided, thinking back about it, I think it was very foolish. In fact, I was an idiot. I would go that far. I would only take a job that I had before I went to the government. I didn't want anybody saying he used the government to advance his job. I had been offered the job of general counsel of the Britannica before I went to the government. The head of the Britannica came to see me and said, if you ever want to leave, the job is still, we haven't filled it, the job is still there. It was a lot of money. It was $100,000 a year instead of $20,000 a year.
In 1960s.
63. It appealed to me for two reasons. We were using savings that would appeal to me financially. It appealed to me because it had nothing to do with the FCC. It was most people who left the FCC went to work either for somebody regulated. Many of them went to work for broadcasters or for. So I decided to do that, and that's when I went in to see the president. As I say, looking back on it, turned out after a couple of years I decided to go back to the law practice because I like being my own boss rather than working for somebody. But particularly because Kennedy was killed, I said to myself, what a dummy I was. I should never have left.
Once you went back to your legal career,
My wife didn't want to leave.
she wanted you to stay with the
Yes,
FCC.
yeah.
Did the family like Washington, D.C.?
Yes. We didn't like the school system, the public school system. We couldn't afford to send them to the private school. The school system was not as good as the school system.
But it's got to be an exciting town to live in.
Very exciting, and we met everybody. We were treated royally. We were invited. There was a group at Bob Kennedy had organized it called the Hickory Hill Seminar. It was some justices of the Supreme Court, some cabinet officers, they would meet once a month in each other's homes and have a speaker. And one time, the president had it. Bob was out of the country, and the president had it in the White House, in the living quarters. And I never forgot this because the speaker was an authority of the Reconstruction period. His name was David Donald or Donald David, one or the other. He was a Yale history professor. I remember exactly what he said. He said, in terms of Lincoln's place in history, if he was going to be assassinated, this was exactly the best moment for it to happen. He had won the war, he'd freed the slaves, he'd been reelected. If it had happened a couple of years earlier, people would have said, what a bum. He didn't know how to win the war. He couldn't hire good generals. He didn't know what to do with the slaves. If it had happened a few years later, people would have said, what a bum. Couldn't deal with this reconciling things with the South or the Reconstruction period. So if you're going to be assassinated, that was the right moment in terms of your place in history. So JFK is listening to this. I remember he's sitting on the couch. He got up, he stood up. And he said, Professor, he said, I listened very carefully to what you said. He said, before I was the president, I used to participate every year in some kind of an evaluation of prior presidents, where you'd say, this guy was a great president, this guy was a medium president, this guy was a weak president. I used to fill that out earlier. He said, but now that I'm the president, I see how ridiculous that is. Because unless you're the president, you really don't know what the facts were, what the pressures were, what the options were. Unless you're the president, there's no way you're knowing. I never forgot that. A few months later, he's killed.
An obvious question, perhaps, maybe a stupid question, but American public still has this fascination with Kennedy. Was that the right moment for him to be assassinated?
Well, fortunately, it was after the Bay of Pigs, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, instead of after the Bay of Pigs. So he showed what he was capable of doing. Because I knew him before, I considered him a contemporary, and I didn't have that awe of now, I started to tell you, the day before I gave that wasteland speech, he spoke to the broadcasters. And he invited me to meet him at the White House and drive to the broadcasters convention. It turned out it was the day that the first American astronaut, Alan Shepard, had come back from space. So I'm waiting outside the Oval Office, and the president came out. And he said, what about taking the Shepards to the, he said, I've got to take them to Congress. What about, we'll take them with us to the broadcasters? I said, that'd be perfect. He said, okay, let me arrange this. So he went back in the Oval Office, came out, he says, come on with me, I want to change my shirt, then we'll go. So he took me up to the living quarters, he takes me in, he's changing his shirt. And he said, what do you think I should say to the broadcasters? And even though I knew him, I was intimidated by this. But I said, what you ought to say is the difference between a free society and an open society. That when we do a space shot, we invite the broadcasters. They cover it live. The whole country can see what's going on. The Russians have a space shot, you never know. It's all closed. Whether it failed, whether it succeeded, you don't know what the hell's going on. You ought to say how proud you are that the broadcasters covered this event for everybody. He doesn't say, good idea. Doesn't say, that's no good. Doesn't say anything. And we go back downstairs. And I see now, he's got LBJ was in the Oval Office too. And the two Shepards, Commander Shepard and Mrs. Shepard. So I see now we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people to get into one car. So I figure I'll get in the second car. And the president says, no. He says, come on. He says, Lyndon, you sit in the jump seat, and Noodle sit in the jump seat, and the two Shepards will sit with me in the back seat. So we get in the car. President is ebullient. This has been a success. You got to remember, this is not long after the Bay of Pigs, which was such a disaster. So he is in heaven. This is work. So he's speaking to the Shepards, and he says, Lyndon, he said, you're the chairman of the National Space Council. He said, but nobody knows that. But he says, Lyndon, believe me, if this thing had not worked out well for Commander Shepard, he said, everybody would know it. So Lyndon looks very glum, and we're sitting next to you, right cheek by jowl in the two jumpsuits.
He's not a small man.
No. So I have a big mouth. I couldn't stop. So I said, Mr. President, I said, if this thing had not been a success, the vice president would have been the next astronaut. so if Lyndon could have killed me with a look, I would be dead. but that's what, I always remember that in the car. Then he got up to the broadcaster, he's introduced. He says the difference between a closed society, he has no notes, and an open society is that we invite the broadcasters to cover a space shot. You guys did a wonderful job, and the whole country could see. So just perfect. He was marvelous.
Mm-hmm. And it makes me reflect that a few years later, obviously he's been dead for several years, but the whole nation in 1969 is staying up late to watch the first man step on the moon.
And I talked to Ted Sorensen. Ted and I became very good friends. I talked to him later about it. He said the president realized, in fact, he said in one speech, he said, "Why are we doing this? It's not because it's easy. It's because it's hard."
And it inspired a nation.
That's right.
Well, let's bring you back to Chicago then. And what are the circumstances in which you come back to Chicago?
Well, we came back to the same environment we had. We bought a house in Glencoe where we had lived before. Kids at this point are all in elementary school. I take the new job. We have some money. And then I realized, then my boss, Bill Benton, who owned the Britannica, he was a partner at the University of Chicago. They owned it together. He calls me one day and he said, "I owe a lot to my banker, Mr. Semenenko, Serge Semenenko of the First National Bank of Boston. He has saved me from disaster several times. He's got a disaster now. He's the banker for Curtis Publishing, and he needs help. Would you go to meet him in New York? Maybe you got an idea for Curtis of what to do." Curtis owned all the magazines, the Saturday Evening Post, Ladies' Home Journal. It was the major, but the magazine business was going to hell, and Curtis was going broke. And the First National Bank would have lost. They had a very heavy loan. And I suggested they merge with a broadcaster. And I had a specific suggestion. A man named John Kluge, who had Metro Media television stations. Mr. Semenenko called him, and by God, they stayed up all night, they made a deal. They shook hands. It would have saved Curtis. And then Mr. Kluge's bankers said, no, it's too risky. So he couldn't do it. So then I helped him for a while, and he wanted me to become chairman of Curtis, which I thought about very hard. But I said, no, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go on the board for a while, but I don't want to take that on, which I did. And that led me to be thinking what I ought to be doing. And I decided I really like being independent. I like being a lawyer and like doing different things. If I continued working for the Britannica, I might have a possibility, but I'd be working really for a family, and I wanted to be independent. And Maury Liebman, my old friend, had been after me for years to join him in the law practice. So I did, and went back to the law in '65. Built up what was a small firm.
What was the firm again?
Liebman, Williams, Bennett, Barrett, and Minow. We built it up, and then we merged with Sidley Austin, my fellow law clerk, Howard Trinans. And we became the largest firm in Chicago, Sidley Austin.
What I'd like to do now is to spend a little bit of time talking about your continued association with Northwestern. And we're sitting here in the faculty lounge looking over the gorgeous view of Lake Michigan here, but wanted to have you reflect on that relationship a little bit. Tell me about returning to Northwestern and how you reestablished that connection.
Well, Northwestern, first of all, honored me and gave me an honorary degree after the FCC. That was in 64 or 5, somewhere in there. And then later, Northwestern asked me to become a trustee, which I did. I had already become a trustee of Notre Dame. I'm the first Jewish trustee of Notre Dame. Father Hesberg asked me to do that. I'm still a life trustee of both institutions. And I became active at Northwestern, but I was very unhappy with the leadership at that time. I felt they were very provincial and ingrown and kept complaining. And then there was an opening for a new president. And the chairman of the board, Tom Ayers, called me. And he said, all you do is bitch, bitch, bitch. I'm going to give you a chance to change the university if you want. I'll make you chairman of the search committee for the new president. And I said to myself, if I do want to change things, this is the way I should do it. So I took that on, and I did my homework, and I discovered that Northwestern had not gone outside for a president in 100 years, and that it needed some livening up and broader view. We did a big search, and I had a search committee of trustees, faculty, staff, and students. And I really worked hard on that. And we got down to 2 people. I swore everybody to secrecy, and they kept it. We got down to 2 people, both outsiders. And I couldn't make up my own mind. And I called Father Hesburgh, and I said, I got these 2 guys. Do you know both of them? And he said, yes. He knew everybody. I said, which one would you take for president of Northwestern? He said, Newt, that is without the dumbest question I've been asked in the last 30 years. I said, why do you say that? He said, I don't know what you need, what you're looking for. If you tell me what you're looking for, what characteristics you want, I can tell you which of the 2 is likely to do that. But unless I know what you're looking for, I can't tell you. So I tell him, I want a strong, tough manager. The place is a mess. And he said, well, take Arnold Weber then. And we did, brought in Arnold. He cleaned house, changed everything. That led to another outsider, and then another. So there have been 3 in a row now. And Northwestern today is a far, far better institution than it was before.
You didn't mention the other candidate. I suspect on purpose you didn't mention the other.
Yeah, he did all right. He became head of another university. But I also joined the faculty and taught. I taught at the law school and at the Medill School of Journalism. I also was asked by Walter Annenberg to run a program for him in Washington in communications policy, and I said, I can do that only if you make it part of Northwestern. And he did, and it became part of Northwestern. Then he gave us $25 million besides. And we did that, so that was my other big thing with Northwestern.
Well, this is a good opportunity to mention some of the other notable alums of the Northwestern Law School, and I think even a couple of them have been professors here as well. Well, let me name the 2 that come to mind for myself is Governor Jim Thompson and Senator Don Clark Netsch.
Yes, and I would add John Paul Stevens and Arthur Goldberg, the 2 Supreme Court justices who were, and Adlai Stevenson, who all 3 were graduates of Northwestern.
A very prestigious group.
Well, this is a fine school, and Howard and I have often talked about this. Howard and I both are Northwestern graduates of the undergraduate school. We both could have gone to any law school. I think we both were students who had acceptable records for law school. But we chose Northwestern for a reason. Northwestern at that time was regarded nationally higher than it is today. And Northwestern had an outstanding dean for decades, in Dean Wigmore, who was an international scholar, Dean Green. And when I came here, Dean Green still taught in the summer. John Paul Stevens was either just finishing when I started or had just finished. He may have been here for one semester. Arthur Goldberg, who is related to my wife's cousin, was of course before us, but he exemplified what Northwestern could produce. Northwestern, and I had professors here, particularly Carl McGowan, Bill Wirtz, Nat Nathanson, who were stellar people. Lloyd Pedrick.
How far back did your connection with Don Clark Netsch go?
Back
Don
to
Clark.
undergraduate school. My wife Jo and I both knew Dawn at college. And she was a year behind us. And also here, when I was here, was Harold Washington. And Gene Pincham was in my class. Gene Pincham, African American. This is an extraordinary story. Our 50th law school reunion, I asked Dean to give a talk to our class. He got up and he said, I'm from Alabama. Because I was black, no law school in Alabama would accept me. But Alabama said if I could get into a law school in the North, they'd pay the bill. I didn't know anything about law schools. I had just gotten out of the Army, but I'd heard of the Northwest Ordinance. So I saw Northwestern Law School. I figured must be some connection between the Northwest Ordinance, Northwestern Law School. And I applied and I got in. And the state of Alabama said they'd pay for it. The next problem is I had to have enough money to get on the train to go to Chicago. And I didn't have it. But my mother said, you come with me about 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., I'll take you down to the state, I'll show you how you can get on the train for nothing. So I got on the train for nothing and came to Chicago. He became the leading criminal lawyer of his generation, tried zillions of murder cases, never lost a capital case. One day I was raising money for the law school and I called him. I said, you've done pretty well, you ought to give me a check for Northwestern. He said, I'll come to your office. He came to my office, he takes a bunch of $100 bills out of his pocket and gives them to me. I said, why are you giving me in cash? Why don't you write a check? He says, in my business, Newt, we deal only in cash, and we get paid up front. He later ran for mayor. He later became a judge. And that was Northwestern Law School.
Wasn't Dawn Clark also something of a trailblazer?
Absolutely. She was one of the first women. I think there were 2 women in my class. But Dawn was not only a woman, but she was a star student. I think she was the top of her class. I think Harold Washington, was in her class, I believe. There was a U.S. Senator who was here with me, Dale Bumpers. There were, in my generation, we were almost all World War II veterans. We all had some sense of public service, all of us. And many of them went into politics and became judges and were very devoted to making this a better country.
Wonder what your thoughts are, having this experience with Northwestern especially, looking at what's going on in education. What do you think colleges, let's keep it at the college level first and then we'll go to a law school. What should they be teaching young people today? How should they be preparing people to be successful?
Well, I don't believe in a lot of the stuff that's going on today. I totally disagree with the unwillingness of certain groups to let other people who disagree with them speak on campus. I do not agree with this idea of safe spaces and all that politically correct stuff. I think college and law school are the place where you grow up and you deal with issues. I think Northwestern is doing fine, but I think certain other schools have renaming things because they didn't like what somebody did at that time. I think a lot of this has gone to excess. Even though I consider myself quite liberal, I think that the political correctness, I hope political correctness has had its day.
Don't think it's quite had its day yet.
I think we're in the process of reevaluating all this stuff now.
Next question then is, how should law schools be preparing the next generation of lawyers?
I think the most important thing is that technology always races faster than law or public policy. Technology moves the speed of light. And technology has outraced a lot of the practices. For example, I'm very interested in telemedicine and the ability of patients to get excellent medical care through technology, and maybe the doctor not even being with them in the same room. But our licensing procedures stand in the way of what technology can do. One of my daughters is a law professor. She's the dean of Harvard Law School. I talk to her about this all the time. She said, we see that artificial intelligence is being used now by advanced lawyers in certain ways. So I think the big challenge now is going to be the technological revolution, the globalism. I see in our own law firm how things have changed. I don't like one thing I see, I don't like at all, is that the profession is becoming less and less a profession and more a business. And the ethical standards and the idea that you perform public service, do pro bono work is under attack. The same daughter is the vice chairman of the Legal Services Corporation appointed by President Obama. There are millions and millions of people in this country who need lawyers, who need help, who are poor, can't afford to pay a lawyer. We've got to, we forget that the person who created that service was Richard Nixon, because he knew that there was an obligation of lawyers to do good in the world.
Wasn't a name I was expecting you to bring up in that respect.
Most people don't know that.
I want to ask you, if you reflect a little bit about the Newt and Joe Minow debate series.
Well, that was the idea of our current dean, who knew, Dan Rodriguez knew how interested I am in debates and my role in the presidential debates. So when they were raising money, they decided to create this debate series, which we've only had one. We're going to have another one this fall. I had lunch with Dan the other day. We're planning what that'll be about. And we made arrangements with a national organization that has the debates on national public radio and has a national as opposed to a local audience. And we bring in top debaters, lawyers, to deal with some burning immediate legal issue.
Any if the particular ones in the past that come to mind in terms of the subjects?
Well, the one that we had so far had to do with, do federal prosecutors have too much power? And we're talking, I'm very interested in one idea, and that is, should you have a right to get rid of false things about you on the internet? should you have a right of reply, as it exists currently in the law in Europe and many of the France and Germany and other countries. Should that come to the United States or shouldn't it?
You surprised by how much discussions about First Amendment rights, freedom of the press, freedom of speech is still very much part of the dialogue today in American politics?
Well, it is, particularly now with the current administration, and you've got, and a lot of issues with the internet, I think, are not yet resolved with social media. This is a real challenge.
Going back to how technology is ahead of
Exactly.
some of our ways of dealing with it. Okay. Your hope then for the future of Northwestern Law School?
I believe Northwestern Law School will always be in the top rank of American law schools, and I believe that what I hope will happen, that we'll continue to produce graduates who have a sense of public service as well as the technical skills to be successful. And I think we will. I think we get top students here. We are able, with the help of the fundraising, to provide scholarships to those who can't afford it. I particularly like the combined law and business program. If I had it to do over again, that's what I would sign up for. I've enjoyed teaching here. I had one year we taught, it was very interesting. We had graduate journalism students and law students in one class.
And what was the second part?
And we're dealing with the law for media, a lot of First Amendment issues. We had the law students and the journalism students together. And in fact, one of our students I see on television all the time now. He's at CNN, and he's very, very good. I hope he influenced him when he was there. Joshua Green is his name.
I was waiting for the name. Okay. How about the issue of civility in the profession? Is that of concern?
Yes, it is. In fact, just yesterday, I watched President Trump's lawyer, who's apparently a very tough, combative guy, and he was on television, and he was anything but civil. And now they're investigating him as part of all the stuff that's going on today with the Russian, whether there was Russian collusion or fake media or whatever. And I can see civility is not part of his vocabulary.
What would you teach young law students in terms of how to comport themselves then?
The most important thing people don't learn is how to listen. Most people are thinking of what they're going to say next rather than listen to what the other person says.
Here's the thread through all of this. Your time in India, communication, FCC obviously about communication, and even being a lawyer, it's about that rarely discussed part of communication, which is listening.
Very few people are good listeners.
Well, hopefully that's what being an oral historian is about. How would you characterize how the law profession has changed during your time?
Well, technology has changed it. When I was a young lawyer, there was no such thing as a Xerox machine. A long-distance phone call was a big deal. There was no internet. There was no looking up things as we do today.
People didn't walk around the street looking at their phone?
No, there were no cell phones. You know, the cell phone is amazing. It's only 10 years old. 10 years old. And look how it has changed America.
For the good?
Good and bad, both. People don't talk to each other. They're so busy looking up stuff on their cell phone.
Would you like for people to turn off the cell phone when they sit down at a restaurant with somebody else?
Absolutely. In fact, we insist on it with our kids and our grandchildren.
Mr. Minow, you're old school in that respect.
Many ways I'm old school.
Yeah. Last question for this morning, and then we're going to take a break. What words of wisdom would you have for the next generation of lawyers?
I would say the law is such an extraordinary opportunity to do good in the world that you should use what you learn to pursue justice every day of your life.
That's a good way to finish for this morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Minow. We'll pick it up this afternoon.
Thank you, Mark.